All right, so welcome to panel one, which will be all about educational opportunity gaps and the research surrounding those gaps. We are pleased to have a video introduction by Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, who is the president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute. We then will have remarks by Dr. Marguerite Roza, who is a research professor and the director of the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University. I just want to pause here to say we have fuller biographies in the program, so we're just doing brief biographies. Otherwise, we'd spend 10 minutes explaining the amazing things these panelists have done. Next, we will hear from Dr. Sharon Reardon, who's a professor of poverty and inequality in education and a professor by courtesy of sociology, as well as the director of the Stanford Interdisciplinary Doctoral Training Program in Quantitative Education Policy Analysis at Stanford University. That was a mouthful. We have Dr. Anindya Kundu. He's an assistant professor of educational leadership at Florida International University. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Prudence Carter, who's the Sarah and Joseph Dowling Professor of Sociology at Brown University. So I will be keeping time and let you know when you have 2 minutes, and then when you're out of time, I'm a ruthless timekeeper. And I just want to make another note, we are live streaming the event. So take it away, Dr. Roza. Oh, right, the video. Thank you. Thank you.
I am thrilled to be here virtually, at least, for the launch of the Education Rights Institute. This is a critically important time to be developing a platform for education rights at a time when they are being threatened in so many ways. The right to a safe environment for students of color, for immigrant students, for LGBTQ students, the right to adequate resources, including qualified teachers, at a time when teacher shortages are leaving classrooms vacant or filled with people who are unprepared in the schools that serve low-income students and students of color, the right to a free, honest, accurate curriculum that lets us understand our history and explore ideas. As W.B. Du Bois put it years ago, of all the civil rights for which we have fought over 5,000 years, the right to learn is undoubtedly the most fundamental. And this institute is really being created to pursue, in many ways, that right. And there's no one better suited to lead this institute than Kimberly Robinson, who is an expert on education rights. I commend to you her book on a federal right to education. Her scholarship has been plowing new ground around what an education right ought to consist of, both at the state level, but also at the federal level. And she has also been involved in bringing those rights into being in her work in the U.S. Department of Education and the General Counsel's Office previously. I commend to you her book on a federal right to education, and I understand the ways in which she is developing new legal theory and assembling others to create a platform for this work to go forward. I'm proud to say she is a senior fellow at the Learning Policy Institute, and we have strongly supported the development of those ideas. This first panel starts off the conference on a critically important note, dealing with the opportunity gap. There's been talk for decades about the achievement gap, and under No Child Left Behind, there were punishments for schools and educators who could not close that achievement gap in schools without any reference to the opportunity differentials that have produced that gap, the poverty and segregation in our schools, the unequal resources allocated to schools serving students with different levels of need, the unequal access to well-qualified educators and to a high-quality curriculum. All of those things produce the opportunity gap. And my dear friend and colleague, Prudence Carter, really named that and shone a light on it in her book by that name with colleague Kevin Wellner, documenting the many ways in which the opportunity gap shows up. My esteemed colleague, Sean Reardon, has demonstrated how ongoing discrimination, including the degree of segregation in districts, contributes to that opportunity gap. You have fabulous thinkers and speakers on this topic in the panel, Marguerite Roza, whose work examines not only how districts and schools are resourced, but also how they can spend those resources in ways that produce greater equity. And Anindya Kundu, who examines how to look at the deep-rooted inequalities in our schools from multiple angles and how to address them, including through the power of student agency, which is something often untapped and not brought to the table. So it's a brilliant panel in what will be a brilliant day. And I know that this is just the beginning of intensive work that will be needed to get to a place where we have a right to education in this country. As Frederick Douglass put it, there is no progress without struggle, so let the struggle begin.
So while we're switching over, I'm going to do a quiz. And the quiz, let's see, do I get it on a picture? Is this it? Yep. Okay. I'm not a PC user. On K-12 education. And you know that because you've been studying this? So actually, it turns out that they're kind of neck and neck. That defense it depends on what administration we have, but these two things are both right now in the neighborhood of, I don't know, $750 billion, which is a number you knew offhand, I'm sure. But there is a fundamental difference, and the reason I asked that question, this isn't really a presentation about defense, I promise you. But what it is where and how inequity creeps in when we talk about public education funds. And first and foremost, defense is funded all out of the federal budget, right? That is not the case with education. Education money comes from here, there, and everywhere. It's a tiny little sliver from the federal government with much bigger shares coming from state coffers or from 14,000 different local funding pots from around the country. That's how many districts that we have. So it's just constructed very, very differently, which means that a lot of messiness can creep in while we're looking at funding our schools. So usually the state funds are distributed in a way to offset the local, right? Like local, we know it's inequitable. I'm assuming that if you came to this event, you know that, right? Okay. So we know that's really inequitable. So state kind of tries to come in and layer on top and smooth it out a little bit. And the federal money, that's pretty progressive, but there's not enough money there to fix all the problems that we see in local funds. And we know that you can have inequities in state funds. It's absolutely true that not as much money is being spent on public education in Utah, in Nevada, or Idaho as we're seeing spent on public education in New York. We also can stipulate that, right? Okay. All right, so we're moving forward. Generally speaking, does local money tend to be distributed in a way that is regressive or progressive? Yeah, that's regressive. These are all the different states. This is a picture from the urban institutes. And all these different states out there, you can see that the local money is regressive. By lots of different ways you can do the measurement. This is their measurement. But generally speaking, local money is regressive. Okay, so then what happens, and I want to tell you how most states work with this. The state says, I know we have a lot of local money, it's regressive. I'm going to come in and try to layer on top and smooth it out. So let's start with this state. This is Idaho, but this is mostly how it works in a lot of states, although the formulas vary. And that is that if at a certain tax rate, 3.5 mil, everybody's familiar with tax rates? That's like 3/1000th of a property value. Okay,
that you have districts over here on the right that can pretty much print cash, right, for their kids, $5,000 or more dollars per kid at this tax rate. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, it's like getting blood from a stone, right? They're at 920, even less than that per student at the same tax rate. So that's the local money. And in comes the state money, and it says, depending on what you can raise, we're going to try to level up to a common amount. So we're somehow trying to take into your local dollars. And then in order to get this stuff passed, we've got to think about hold harmless for some districts and other kind of stuff, any other offsets we want to do. But the state money is generally more progressive in the sense it's trying to accommodate that, right? Well, a couple issues here, including the fact that we still have some of these districts that can make a lot more money. If you're familiar with Idaho, there's communities like McCall, anybody nod with that, nice lakefront properties where they have really gazillion-dollar homes. And they have a lot of money because they've got a lot of property value, and so they could still raise a lot more. And usually what states do is rather than take the money away from them, they hold their nose and let them collect it. And so there you have one source of inequity. Then there's another kind. If you've been in Idaho, you've been to communities where some people are like, yeah, even the part we're supposed to raise ourselves, we don't really want to. And we say sometimes, maybe there are people who just hate kids in that community, or maybe what happens there is that they're farmers and they really don't want to drive up the price of land, or maybe there's other things going on. It can be a whole lot of stuff. But if they don't raise their local share, even though the state is smoothing out, they're still well below. Right, so you see these kind of problems creep in communities, state after state. So that's a couple of the type of inequities we have. And I'm going to come back to the money part in a minute, but then talk about how the money when the money gets to districts, it's district leaders that then decide how much goes to each school. So we have the federal piece that's sprinkling some money around, but it's not enough money to do a whole lot with. Then you have the state and local chunk, then it lands on the district, and then a group of people from the community that work at the district say, how much should this school get and how much should that school get? And they make those decisions based on how many people do I send here and what salaries do I pay them and how many computers do I send here and so on. So what we see at this very localized level, this is a real district, is these are the elementary schools on the left and the middle schools on the right. They're color-coded by how many kids in poverty they have. So the redder the color, the higher the needs the student population. And in this district, even though they've taken all their money in, they've decided, perhaps inadvertently, to give their highest poverty schools less money at both elementary and middle level. So no level of revenues can fix that. These are decisions that are happened at the local level and how they disseminate their cash. And when this came up in districts, and we show districts our data all the time, not all districts have this pattern. Some have the reverse. Some have a mix. But in this one, the CFO said, well, I mean, the lower spending in those schools is because the schools have junior staff. So we have senior staff at the more affluent schools. They draw down higher salaries. That drives up our spending. I mean, it's not really worth worrying about. And I'm telling you, that's not an unusual statement. We work with district leaders all over the country. We hear that very often. And we would say back, well, I mean, if they have a revolving door of staff, that is a problem. You only get a whole junior staff if some of them leave every year, and then you get some new ones, and then some of them stay with teaching, but they move over to the more affluent school, and you've lost that expertise. And that revolving door actually is part of what affects kids. It's showing up in the money, but it's a different problem. So this is kind of a reminder. Maybe it's not even the seniority levels. Maybe it's that we wanted to put our STEM program in one of these other schools and that brought more staff. Or maybe last time we did cuts, we cut music across all our schools, but the kids marched in playing their instruments from one of the schools and we protected them. You can see it all happens, a lot of this stuff at the local level. So I said the patterns differ all over the country. You can look up your own data if you want, if you're a researcher and you want to examine this. We now have newly available school-by-school spending data on every school in the country, something that did not exist 3 years ago. So the world's changing and modernizing. It's called the NERDS data set. a cleverly named data set that my teammates put together called the National Ed Resource Database on School Spending. But you can see here's another district where sometimes the variations in spending are pretty big. It's $5,000 more per student spent on the school I've circled off to the right versus the one at the left. And this is all new. We haven't been examining it because we didn't used to have data on it. So I want to do one other, let's see if I can get this to this, is talk about another timely event in my little time I have. And that's something we're calling the ESSER fiscal cliff. And you guys have all been really paying attention to that, right? So what that is, ESSER is the federal relief money that came out for schools. And it was delivered in a way that was very progressive. Schools like Detroit got over $20,000 a kid, and some wealthy districts got none. So it was a strong amount of money for higher poverty schools. Anyway, the last day you can spend that money is September 30th, 2024. And after that, schools are going to have to adjust to the loss of these massive amounts of dollars. So what we've been forecasting is that districts with more students in poverty face a steeper fiscal cliff. These are the numbers for Washington State. We actually think most other states will see a greater difference. But districts with less than 25% kids in poverty will see 2% of their budget disappear. Districts with 75% or more will see 6% of their budgets disappear. The rule of thumb is that 0.5% a decline in budget sends a district into fiscal chaos. So brace yourselves. It's going to get really kind of tumultuous out there. And I want to give an explanation of how this is going to unleash a whole nother round of problems for schools. First of which is school districts will lay off their junior staff first. Remember where they all work, right? And that's something called LIFO, last in, first out. And what that will mean is that some schools, often with a higher mix of kids in need, will see a bigger portion of their staff walk out the same day with these layoffs. Out the door will go many of our newly hired teachers of color who match the race of the kids that are in these schools. And then we will see classes where they say, we have a hiring freeze. I know we don't have a math teacher right now, but the PE teacher is going to be teaching math for now in this school. So that is all going to happen. That turmoil is going to be really distracting. And then what we're going to see is years where we recover from these kind of financial disruptions. So it's going to become worse before it gets better. And then I want to chase one other thing that's coming down the pipeline is what's going to happen to state budgets, which also look like they're not going to grow at the rate they have been. So remember, the states right now are mostly playing the role of equalizing, right? They're the ones that are equalizing. So here are two districts that I know nothing about in New York. Maybe you guys do. One is Poughkeepsie. I just like the word, so I brought that one in. So it is a higher poverty district, and it's more reliant on state money. So it's got about the same amount of money as South Colony per student, but it's heavily reliant on the state, right? And over there in South Colony, they could raise a lot of money on their own, so they don't really worry as much about the state money. But when the state tightens the reins on the state funds, which of these districts disproportionately hurts? So that's another thing we saw in the last Great Recession, and we're forecasting that we're going to see a lot more of this tightening of the money from the state, which means we'll have less money to do more equalizing. And the last thing I want to finish on there is, why don't we just get rid of the local money, right? Like, it's such a corrupting factor here. We should just get rid of it and say, you know what, no local money. Let's fund education from the state or the federal level. Why don't we do that? I mean, it still seems like a no-brainer, right? Because people vote yes on local taxes and no on state and federal taxes. So we have this conundrum that's been really hard. So that's where it becomes, we need this counteracting pressure of law, because voters themselves will say yes to local money, and if we got rid of all the local money, we wouldn't have much money left in our schools. They say no to state and no to sometimes to federal. So anyway, I hope that put you in a really good mood, because we've got some other great panelists going on, and I'll leave that at that. We have a lot of training on this stuff if money is your jam. So, you're going to switch it over. Okay.
There's a beeping in the background. There's something. Did you hear that? That was the mic.
Is it on? Great, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here for the launch of the Education Rights Institute. I'm really happy I could make it. I was reminded this morning, based on a conversation I was having, when I was a much younger person, I taught high school. And I started out teaching high school on the Oglala Lakota Reservation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, which is about the size of Connecticut. It has about a population of about 25,000 people. It was, at the time, the poorest county in the United States, a distinction that I don't think has changed since then. I taught there for 2 years and learned a lot. I hope my students learned something, but I certainly learned a lot about America from those 2 years. And then I went after that and I taught high school for 2 more years in Morristown, New Jersey, an affluent, leafy suburb in South Jersey outside of Philadelphia. I did not deliberately choose these 2 places. It's a longer story about how I sort of ended up in both of them. But you probably could not have picked 2 more different parts of America. And as a young man, I was struck by how unequal and different the lives of the young people growing up in these 2 communities were. And how different the kind of opportunities they had, not just in the school system, but in their lives as a whole. And it was eye-opening, and it was really what led me to go to graduate school and then to sort of study this. And in some ways, I've spent my whole professional career since then thinking about the differences and opportunities kids have who, really by virtue of growing up just in different parts of this country under different economic conditions. So this is what I think of as a picture of unequal education opportunity in America. So this is a picture that my colleagues and I made. Each dot here is a single school district among the 13,000 or 14,000 school districts in the United States. And what we've done is we've taken the standardized test scores for every student in those school districts over a 10-year period and harmonized them so that we can compare the average test scores of kids in different places. And we think of those test scores as a measure of opportunity. Right? There's no reason that the children born in one place have different innate capacities than the children born in another place on average. So the only reason why they should have different outcomes when we look at them in 8th grade, say, is because they've had different opportunities to develop the kinds of skills and capacities that are measured by our standardized tests. And if you look at the most affluent places in America and compare them to the poorest places in America, like the Morristown's way up here and Oglala Lakota County way down there, there's a difference in average test scores between those communities on the order of 5 grade levels. The kids in the rich communities are scoring about 2 or 3 grade levels above the national average, and the kids in the poorest communities are scoring about 2 or 3 grade levels below the national average, solely as a result of different educational opportunities that they've had throughout their lives and in their schools. Right? So this is a picture of the opportunity gap that Prudence and Kevin Wellner wrote about in their book, as measured by one outcome. If you took any other kind of outcome we valued, you would probably see something quite similar to this in terms of the pattern. And one thing it shows you is that there's really no poor place in America, no place where kids grew up in poverty and around other people growing up in poverty, that's able to provide the kinds of educational opportunities equal to those in our most affluent places. And so that says when we're thinking about equality of educational opportunity and education rights, we sort of need to think about structural conditions. There's a lot of well-intentioned, hardworking, deeply committed teachers and parents in those communities, but that's not enough to overcome the big structural conditions that constrain their children's opportunities and life chances. And so we need to sort of think structurally is the sort of takeaway that I have from this. If we look at the long-term trends over time, there's some good news and some bad news in terms of educational opportunities. So this shows the trends in in test score gaps, or you can think of them as opportunity gaps, by race and by income. And if you look at the racial gaps, the white-black or the white-Hispanic gap over time, those gaps are still quite large. They're on the order of 1.5 or 2 grade levels in the most recent cohorts, but they're much smaller than they were 50 years ago. So we have made some progress in equalizing racial inequalities in educational opportunity. We have not made progress in equalizing economic disparities in educational opportunity. In fact, those are much larger than they used to be, and much larger than racial disparities now. Next thing I want to say is if we look within individual school districts, we see evidence of big disparities, even in the same community, in the kinds of opportunities get. So the way to read this picture is to think that on the horizontal axis is the average test scores of third grade white students in a district, and the vertical axis is the average third grade test scores of black students in the same district. So, for example, this, which I think is Atlanta, the average third grade white student in Atlanta is scoring at about a 5.5, 6th grade level, and the average black third grader in Atlanta is scoring at about a 1st grade level. So there's a disparity, this distance from this line is on the order of 4 grade levels difference among third grade white and black students in the same community. So very different levels of education opportunity, not just between communities, but within communities. If there were equal opportunities by race within the community, we would expect students' scores to fall along that diagonal line. There's almost no district in America where white and black students in the same community grow up with the same level of educational opportunity by 3rd grade. If you look at it in 8th grade, many of the districts have moved even further away from that line. That is, the disparities have grown, meaning that opportunities are even more unequal by the time they get to 8th grade. And a different way to look at the same picture, and this is one is, I think, particularly useful, is to say how fast are kids learning while they're in schools, right? Some of the reason there's unequal opportunity is things that happen early in kids' lives before they even get to kindergarten. They have unequal access to high-quality childcare and preschool. They live in neighborhoods with very different kinds of opportunities. Their families don't have the same kinds of resources to provide opportunities to their kids. And so we can't lay all of those unequal opportunities on the schoolhouse steps, right? Some of them are present in the broader society and affect kids even before they get to school. But what happens while they're in school? Do they get the same opportunities in school? And one way to do that is to say, within the same school system, do black and white students learn at the same rate, even if they started at a different place? Are they getting sort of the same opportunity to make equal progress? And so now the horizontal axis is the average learning rate for white students versus the average learning rate for black students. And you can see, in this case, there are some districts that fall on that diagonal line, and even some that are above it. So if you looked at these districts up here, these are places where both white and black students are learning faster than the national average, and black students are learning faster than white students in that school district. So those are places that are not only producing high overall opportunities for kids, but even better opportunities for the black students in those districts and the white students. Unfortunately, most districts aren't up there, and in most of the large districts sort of fall a little bit below that line, meaning that in most school districts, the black-white achievement gap is widening as the longer kids are in school, because the black-white opportunity gap is wide while kids are in school in those places. So the next thing is we want to look and say, what is it that drives those unequal opportunities while kids are in school? And the biggest predictor we've found in all our looking through these data for a long time is racial and economic segregation. So this vertical measure here is the white-black difference in learning rates. You can think of that as a measure of the white-black difference in opportunities kids have to learn while they're in school. So if it's above 0, it means white students are getting more opportunities to learn while they're in school than black students are in the same school district. And the horizontal axis here is a measure of segregation of the school districts, the extent to which black students are concentrated in high poverty schools and white students are concentrated in lower poverty schools. So it's a combination of both racial and economic segregation. And in places where white students are much more concentrated in high poverty schools than low poverty schools, we see much bigger disparities in the learning opportunities that children have. And where those white and black students aren't concentrated in different schools of different levels of poverty, we see small or no differences in the disparities. And so segregation, that is between school, racial and economic segregation, seems to generally create conditions of unequal learning opportunity for some of the reasons that Marguerite was talking about and lots of other reasons. High poverty schools aren't able to marshal or sustain the same kind of teaching force, political and social capital of their families, and things like that in order to provide the same kinds of opportunities. Not to say there aren't some very, very good schools serving large concentrations of low-income students, but it's hard to do that at scale. So if segregation is part of the problem, what are the trends in it? So my colleague Ann Owens at USC and I have been putting together this data where we're assembling data on segregation levels for going all the way back to the 60s. And you can see here that in the 100 largest districts in the US, segregation, black-white segregation, was very high in the late 60s before Green and Swan decisions really took effect. And then there's a dramatic drop in segregation in many of those districts. And the sort of high watermark or low watermark of segregation in this figure is in the 80s, and segregation has been gradually going up in those districts ever since. It's not as high as it was then in absolute terms, but it's certainly much higher, about 50% higher than it was in the 50s. And if you look at a bunch of different districts, you see this pattern is present in many of them, though to different degrees. You know, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, you know, segregation drops virtually to zero and then creeps up and up again, and then the court order is released in the early 2000s and it goes way up. So that's the kind of pattern we'd see in lots of school districts where desegregation was quite effective at creating, if not integrated schools in the sort of social cultural sense that Naila and Prudence have talked about, but at least creating integrated schools in the demographic sense, which is a precursor to the kind of real integration we want. Desegregation efforts in the late 60s and early 70s were quite effective in most places, but we've even sort of lost that ground. So I want to end by sort of suggesting a couple things, lessons from this. One is efforts to think about a federal right to education or any kind of collective right to education should also think about that right in early childhood. That is, it's too late to sort of fix it if we just create equal opportunities from kindergarten onward. We need to think about the rights for kids to have equal educational opportunities early in their lives. Segregation is important in thinking about this. Third, a big part of what drives educational inequality in the US is between district structural inequalities, and no amount of sort of equalizing, even though I showed you some sort of that the within district disparities are big, the between district disparities are even bigger. 2/3 of the segregation in the US is between districts and so on. And finally, the last thing I want to say is that in schools of education where I work, people study the effects of policies a lot. They say, what's the effect of this policy and what does it do on inequality? But I think one of the things that I'm hoping you guys will do and others should do is think about why do we have the policies we have and how do we change those policies? Like we live in a policy regime that creates and fosters and sustains and reinforces a number of different kinds of inequality. And the question we should be asking is not just which policies are sort of good and bad, which we do a lot in schools of education, but how do we change those policies? What are the levers? What creates and sustains a kind of regime where we have the kind of inequality producing policies? And so I'm sort of hoping, I was sitting here thinking today, I'm hoping that's the kind of work that you guys will help us do. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at this very important event, and I'm humbled to be amongst some giants in my field. And also, I hope everyone in the audience is doing well and that your families are doing well at this time also. My name is Anindya Kundu, and I'm a sociologist and assistant professor of educational leadership at Florida International University, FIU, in Miami. Given that this is a room full of legal thinkers, I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the laws and policies coming out of the great state of Florida at this time. That's kind of how our governor likes it, to stay in the news as a so-called education governor. But I'm not so sure how you can be called that in a good way when your state is 47th lowest in teacher pay. So I'd like to use some of my time today to recenter what's important, because I think we often get distracted from the aims, and I think a lot of that is by design. And so today I'll talk a lot about how I want to see a school system where every child belongs, and an education system where children are provided opportunity where they don't have it. So I'll start by telling a story of one of my students. Her name's Deborah. Deborah is a black female educator who is an elementary school teacher and reading coach. And when she first started her teaching career, she taught first graders at an elementary school called Broadmoor in Little River, Miami, which is a very low-income community and a Title I high school. So all students are coming from below the poverty line. And very quickly into teaching these young kids, Deborah realized how much they loved story time. So she instituted a classroom library where students would be able to take books home with them and then bring them back to exchange for another book. But very quickly, there was a problem that arose. The books were going home, and they were not coming back to school. So at this point, Deborah asks, why is this happening? And she could have gone one of two ways. First, to find a flaw or a deficit within the students, say there's something wrong with them, they're keeping things that don't belong to them, and use that as an opportunity to teach them a lesson. Or she could do what she did, which was find a flaw within the system. So she started with the most basic, obvious fact, which was that these students don't have books at home. So this was an opportunity gap that she identified, which she decided to pour into. So Deborah partnered with her school library and local libraries to get more books donated to the classroom library, and she also got her students library cards. So officially, instead of making her students feel bad about themselves, they started to feel that they were capable and worthy of more. And so Deborah used her own agency to foster the agency of her students. And in my qualitative research around the country, where I've been interviewing educators like Deborah and students who have overcome deep opportunity gaps, along with my literature review of sociology, I define agency as a person's ability to leverage resources, social or cultural, to overcome the obstacles that they face in their lives. And so, as many of my co-panelists have spoken today about, a lot of these obstacles are structural, and therefore they cannot be overcome by individual level factors alone. And so this is what separates agency from words like growth mindset, resilience, and grit. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have books at home, how much is grit going to help you? And I say that as a very loving mentee of Angela Duckworth. We have structural obstacles at every facet of the world, and so we need structural level solutions. And Deborah's story also, to me, is the power of education. Our teachers are not just simply ambassadors of content, but they are ambassadors of character and democratic values. So for the remaining time in my remarks, I'd like to talk about what Deborah did, which was flip the script. Or specifically, she revealed what was hidden about her students' situations. In education research, we have long used this concept of the hidden curriculum to mean the lessons, the values, and ideas that teachers pass on implicitly without maybe not realizing it, first coined by Philip Jackson. And in my recent work, some of my conceptual work, I'm broadening this idea of the hidden curriculum to say it's not just how that success works in schools, but that's how success largely works in society too. And by keeping the hidden curriculum hidden, the actual tools that we need for success, access to it is diminished, and therefore we have perpetuated this unequal status quo. And so I'd like to talk about how we can continue to reveal the hidden curriculum to close certain opportunity gaps that children face in their lives. So here are three areas that I think we have to focus on. These are direct opportunity gaps that can be leveraged by revealing the hidden curriculum. So the first is a relationship gap. 80% of US jobs are secured through a personal connection. whether that be through 1 or 2 degrees of separation. And so what that means is that there is a drastic social capital gap between low-income communities and wealthier communities where students may have a connection or an uncle who can get them an internship that's going to look great on their high school or college resumes. And low-income communities, as we're aware, through social forces, are often displaced by companies, and then those companies do not hire from those same low-income communities. It feels fitting to say that this is also a problem that universities often promote, maybe not UVA, but certainly my alma mater, University of Chicago, which was nestled in the south side of Chicago. And so these organizations, to me, have a relationship debt where they have to work with schools to teach students how to form relationships with one another, how, when, and why to ask for help in order to actually get it, and also how to form meaningful relationships with their peers and the adults in their lives. Secondly, we have a representation gap. We can see this in the curriculum itself. So as you may have heard, Florida recently banned the program AP African American Studies History from being allowed in our state. In 2010, Arizona had banned ethnic studies, even though ethnic studies was showing gains for our students across content areas. And so we have to ask ourselves, is the curriculum something where all students are seeing their lived experience reflected so they can see the relevance in what they're learning in their lives? Or, as the research shows, are we simply promoting a very Anglo-Saxon, European-centric notion of whose history matters? And as demographers and sociologists will tell you, by 2040, the majority white population and the minority other races population will flip. And so one way to think about that demographic change, to me, is a deadline for social cohesion. When we actually have these demographic changes, are students going to see themselves reflected in the curriculum, or are they going to see only one prioritized notion of what success looks like that they don't fit into? Representation also matters in the physical space of schools. The teaching force of public schools is drastically not nearly as diverse as the students, and this only gets worse the higher up you go in the chain into positions such as assistant principals, or district leaders. And children, you're kidding yourself if you don't think children are cognizant of these kinds of differences and internalizing what these mean for themselves. Lastly, we have a wellness gap, and the gap is primarily that we don't think about wellness at all. The pandemic was supposed to potentially provide us an opportunity to think about and center wellness in our conversation of achievement, but those schools or districts that do that are very few and far between. So now we have a system where teachers are burnt out. We have this national teacher shortage crisis. Teachers are citing overwork, overburden, lack of autonomy, and lack of value for reasons of leaving the profession. And children today are also suffering from historically low mental health indicators related to anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and everyone is actually suffering from increased addiction to substances, increased addiction to technology. And so I see schools as our great social institution as something that we have to uphold in order to spread wellness and close wellness gaps. And so I mentioned that the hidden curriculum is also how society works at large, and I think we can see this playing out when we think about certain value systems, or what I would say are ironies of our system. And many of my co-panelists have very eloquently talked about some of these gaps. And these are 3 areas that I believe we have to reveal the hidden curriculum and flip the script. The first is accountability. So teachers and students are the ones who are consistently tested and then rewarded or punished based on those outcomes. My question is, if a school district has a number of failing schools within it, is that district leader not also then failing? Or is that so-called education governor not failing? We have to ask ourselves, why is it that we penalize teachers for adhering to this system? Atlanta had its most expensive civil case in the teachers' cheating scandal, where some teachers were handed jail sentences whose test scores did not even matter when it came to funding. And at the same time, we're quite aware that there is blatant fraud in corporate banking or mortgage lending, and the outcomes of those practices lead to social catastrophes. but so often those people get let off the hook. We also have funding irony. As Marguerite talked about, our system of democratic control, which is highly popular amongst the population, that's because we think of it as the democratic system. But what happens is in our capitalist framework, where there are winners and losers, and those with power and privilege can concentrate their resources and take them with them, the system becomes elitist. And so we've had historical movements of white flight, white families moving to the suburbs, leaving behind desolate areas of poverty and inequality, and also the redlining of school districts, which is why we're talking a little bit about how schools today, or many districts, are as, if not more, segregated than Brown versus Board of Education. And the legal scholars, I believe, call that happening by practice, de facto, but not de jure. And so I think we need explicit legislation and mandated laws that offer us a more democratic system of funding. And lastly, the achievement irony we have is that I think we are focused on a very vague, unclear, and unproductive notion of what achievement should be. We are all social creatures, yet we prioritize this falsely meritocratic idea of what achievement looks like, winners at the expense of losers, and that zero-sum game. We have to consider the achievement of all people as something that we are all invested in, especially our children. And if we consider achievement and wellness as going hand in hand, perhaps we can consider the achievement of all students a collective pursuit that we should uphold. And so those are my remarks for today. If you enjoyed any of my comments, I recommend my book, The Power of Student Agency. And if anybody wants to keep in touch and continue the conversation, you can find me on social media at Dr. Anindya Kundu. Thank you.
How are you doing? Good afternoon. I'm Prudence Carter, and it's really a pleasure to be here to celebrate the opening of the Equal Rights Institute, and just congratulations. I'm so happy for you, Kimberly, and for you, the University of Virginia. I mean, this can be a hot spot of action to ameliorate, to help ameliorate change in our society, and particularly our system. I want to talk, I'm so excited also because I got to be with my friends, like people I've known over the years who are doing great things. And this is something obviously that is near and dear to many of us. And it's something that so many of us think we know something about because we all went to school. But I wonder if I could be provocative here today and talk about the extent to which we really want to eradicate the opportunity gaps in American society. And I want to suggest to you that the opportunity gaps to be reduced I don't necessarily think that we can we know that we can't fully eradicate inequality of outcomes because there's so much variation at the individual levels and communities and families. But what we can do is, to the extent possible, is to approximate better equality of opportunities. And I want to suggest to you today that the opportunity gap goes beyond education. And it is important for us to think of both in and out of school factors as we talk about how to make life better in the long term for learners in this country. And I'm going to actually focus on a happy story. Something that I think is actually the glass half full that may make the point for me today. And it didn't actually come to me until a few months ago, after all these years of doing this work, when Kevin Weldner and I edited this volume that is an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary project. We didn't write the book, we edited it, and we brought in scholars from across the disciplines, focusing on various systemic parts of the puzzle of opportunity, including in-school factors, teaching, curricular and instruction, having high-quality teachers, right? Thinking about culture in school and belonging, but we also thought about other parts of the system. in terms of thinking about healthcare, housing, the forces of segregation. And we wanted folks to hear from those who thought about the life course development from early education to higher education. The opportunity gaps focus on an ecology of either inequality or an ecology of opportunity, to thinking about an ecology of inequality and an ecology of opportunity, which brings together the various social, economic, political, and cultural factors in our society, is what it will take to actually reduce the impact of those gaps. So a lot of us see the symptoms in the achievement gaps, right? We talk about that in terms of test scores, in terms of high school graduation rates, college going rates, and those things. But we have to focus on really what the cancers are, the causes of the disease. And I'm going to suggest to you that that means that educational researchers have to be in conversation, legal scholars, those of us who focus on the institution of education, with those who work in other areas. And I'm putting them up here because there is a dimension, there's a social institution, there's an institution in our society that has figured it out. And that institution is the Department of Defense, whose students for the last 20 years have been outperforming students nationally, all 50 states. And so I have to go back because I hit something. This came to me, and I have to give the credit to Sarah Mervosh, who's the education journalist at the New York Times, who reached out to me about this. And after, she said, can you help me go through this and really parse it out and understand what's going on? So I love data, and I decided after talking to her, and we talked through what she was finding, that I was going to delve into that data myself and try to do some preliminary analysis, which I'm going to share with you today. And the reason why I think that this is an interesting sphere to think about opportunity gaps is because of the Department of Defense, which is that was an interesting finding, Marguerite, thank you, a fact, to hear about how much is actually put into the defense budget versus education. But I had no idea to think about the kids of those who serve in our military. There are 66,000 students in DoD schools, served by more than 8,000 educators. The students in those schools are the children of those who are coming in, working class privates in the military and army. So some of their parents, you have to have a high school education to go into the military, but some are just high school grads only, all the way up to the commissioned officers' children. So you got the socioeconomic diversity. You know that we already have racial and ethnic diversity in the military, right? It is the institution that, in fact, was really to integrate much earlier than schools were, because we knew what the implications were for our national security. But the other thing that the military has understood, if you read their material, is that student readiness, student preparedness, is also influenced by parental employment, emphasis on education, strong inputs, housing, healthcare. All of these other things that many of us in this room can take for granted, for the most part today. But a lot of the kids that are shown in the data that Sean and Marguerite have shown, or that Anindya has shown, can't take for granted across the nation. So for more than 2 decades, not just recently, 2 decades, the Department of Defense kids who are public school kids, but they're under the auspices of the Department of these schools, several jurisdictions, including 7 states, some are across the globe, have been outperforming kids across the nation, across socioeconomic status and across race. So let me just show you something. In 2022, this is when the National Assessment of Educational Progress test was given. And for those of you who don't know NAEP, that's like the Nation's Report Card study, right? It's an achievement test used to ascertain how well the nation's kids are doing in various subjects. All 50 states, for the most part, kids' scores went down in reading and math and science and those things. In the Department of Defense schools, they went up. This is just a snapshot of the 8th grade math and reading scores in 2022. This is disaggregated by the level of parents' education. You can see that kids who's in the military, so the orange is for DOD kids, and the blue is for the rest of the nation. You can see for math and reading, DOD kids across each level of parent background by education have outscored those in the national level. Here's a 20-year period across 2 decades how well they've done by that parent education level. The dashed lines are those kids who are in the Department of Defense schools, and the straight lines are those who are nationally. And let me just kind of walk you through that for those of you who are, this is too much going on in this slide. You'll see here in the blue line, these are the kids who are nationally, whose parents did not finish high school at all. And you see that actually there were some injections or something going on, but they started to fold down. About right here, it peaked in around 2011 on the NAEP scores, and then of course they've gone down since the pandemic. But look, these are the lines where I want to focus, because this is where the comparison can be. The orange are those students whose parents only finished high school. The yellow or gold are those whose parents have some post-high school college, education, but no college. And the green are some high school, some college degree. They finished college. You will see that DOD kids whose parents had a high school degree have outpaced their peers across the nation whose parents only have a high school degree. And they've even surpassed those kids who are across the nation whose parents have more than a high school degree, starting here in the 2020 data, right? So they've outpaced them there. If you go to the college degree, those kids who are more kind of middle, upper middle, probably commissioned officers and such, you'll see that the DOD kids weren't necessarily in 2000 doing as well as those who were college-educated parents in 2000, but look at what has happened over time. With the infusion of what the DOD is called continuous improvement investing, tinkering with their curriculum, talking about the kinds of curricular things in terms of being culturally sensitive and relevant. And so they're outpacing their peers nationally in these schools at every parent level. And it is also the case that kids who are in the Department of Defense schools, whose parents just have some education outside of high school, have outpaced the kids whose parents went to college in the nation. There's something going on. Let me show you even a little bit more. This is disaggregating about race. Some really startling findings. I mean, not startling, but really fantastic. It makes me happy to know that the things that we use to essentialize sometimes around race and class don't have to really be so, because we have different kinds of injections of opportunities going on. When you look, for example, Black students in the DOD schools have been doing better across the 22-year period than Black school students on average nationally. White students the same way. At one point they converged around 2007, and now they're outpassing their peers nationally. The same for Latinx kids, and these are not just by like a few points. These are huge differences in terms of the test scores. And for Asian students, thank you. For Asian students, there was some outpacing, and then there was some convergence in the 2022. So we want to ask why, what's going on, or what may have been, and that's where qualitative research really comes in, which is what I am, by the way. I can't believe I'm showing you these data, but this is what I do. I do both. So here are the reading scores. They actually mirror what the math scores did. But here's a big finding that was pointed out in Sarah's reporting in the New York Times, too. You would notice that this last NAEP, that that for the last NAEP on the 8th grade reading scores, that Black students in the DOD schools actually perform better than white students across the nation. The opportunity gaps have been reduced in the Department of Defense schools. We can actually do it. But this is what's showing us, possibly indicating what happens when education is actually a federal right, when the federal government is in charge, when you don't have all that messiness going on at the local levels that we're talking about in the state levels. what potentially could happen. Now, it's not showing that there's a full eradication of either socioeconomic or racial gaps, because there are other things that obviously shape the calculus. But it is showing us what can happen in terms of at least keeping those gaps smaller when you provide all these other things in the system, both in and out of school. And the DOD explicitly talks about bringing in both in and out of school, or treating those factors. So I'm going to end by saying federal rights to schooling and living are really what are important, and that all learning opportunities within schools have to be talked about in an ecological way. One of the reasons why I enjoy the field that I'm in now, my discipline, is that we think about society writ large and the intersections of those things. And so one of the things, Kimberly, that I hope is that because complex, multidimensional social and academic problems require multidisciplinary and are interdisciplinary focus or foci, that the conversation will be broader among the academic research community and the policy community. And we don't just limit ourselves to thinking about the infusion, which I know some say, well, those liberals and progressives, I am one of those, admittedly. They want to put the whole kitchen sink in there. But that's actually what we provide those of us whose children are flourishing for most of our kids. Why can't we do it for all? So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
All right, so thank you for all of those insights and remarks. So I want to talk about, so we've had really a laying out of the opportunity gap and understanding different aspects of it, as well as just ended on a note of what is possible. I'm interested in further diving into sort of some promising and innovative practices. So it seems like the DoD defense schools are sort of one place to look for lessons on how to close opportunity gaps. I'm interested in hearing from, and this is a question I get often, once I explain opportunity gaps, then they immediately say, so what are some innovative practices that are taking place to close them? Let everybody speak at once.
Well, I'll just add one. And so when we look at either states that have made more progress in addressing inequities across districts, or in districts that have made more progress in addressing inequities across schools, it seems to be that they're focusing on the data. So, and that data can give rise to lawsuits, which have been helpful at the state level in many places. It can give rise to advocacy. It can give rise to means of measuring progress and things like that. And maybe that's self-serving because I'm like a data lover on this, but that's one piece we've seen.
Sure. Sometimes I've said that innovation is daring to implement common sense. So we know that a lot of the achievement gap is based on non-academic factors, so I think that's where we have to focus. We're seeing school districts around the country now legislating free and reduced lunch for all students, and why that's important is because it takes the stigma of poverty away from those who actually can't afford free and reduced lunch, so it fosters students' sense of belonging and sense of self. Sometimes schools do extended school hours because parents work multiple jobs and need help to keep the kid at school so they can pick them up per their schedules. And so we really have to think of schools as more of a community hub, I think, and that goes back to reframing what is achievement for and how are we thinking of achievement.
I would just make a plug for early childhood. So access to high quality early childhood, like childcare and preschool, in communities that don't have it, is a way to sort of substantially, I think, increase equality of opportunity early in kids' lives. That then makes it sort of easier for the K-12 system to sort of to build on that.
There are two things that come to my mind. First is, one, I don't think we can do a one-size-fit-all. Most of American education policy tries to focus on homogenizing and standardizing, and because there's so much heterogeneity in learning in communities and particularities, I wish we could come up with a constellation of different effective strategies that districts could pick and choose and come up with combinations of them for themselves. So that's where I want the local and the state to maintain itself. Can the federal government, though, marshal evidence that could become available, that can be disseminated much better, and then effectively train the implementers? That's the one thing that I would suggest. The second is, I think we have to be real about what poverty and wealth and class inequality does in terms of the family, and how supports can be existent. So what is the role of nonprofits, right, in educational organizations to help mediate or facilitate that role when it comes to schools? Because we keep looking at the outcomes. Those outcomes are shaped by so many factors that some families the parents can barely afford time to be at home to help support their kids, where the rest of us can get tutors or babysitters and all kinds of things to make sure that our children's education is supplemented.
Thank you. So then, given the opportunity gaps we've just talked about and some of the promising practices that are available, what do you think are the chief obstacles to us closing opportunity gaps as a society? What's keeping us from allowing them to continue generation after generation, and even replicating and expanding them?
Well, I would say economic inequality and structural and historical racism in American society. It's important to keep in mind that material conditions really matter. That's why people with money guard it so carefully. And so as long as you have a society that's as economically unequal as ours, and where economics are patterned by race and history of racism, it's very hard to sort of think about how you do sort of local interventions that undo that. And so I think it's that history of economic and racial inequality, coupled with the growing idea of education as a private good rather than a public good. And Naila touched on this in her remarks. If you think of education as a private good and you have vast inequalities in wealth and resources, then the people with all the wealth and resources find a way to accrue more of that private good to themselves. And so I think the real challenge is, one, how do you reduce economic inequality in America? That might be bigger than your charge, but let's all work on it. And secondly, how do you get people to reframe and think about education as a public good in the way Naila was talking about, so that they can sort of see there's mutual benefit to making sure everyone has equal opportunities, rather than sort of hoarding it and pulling up the drawbridge behind them kind of as they get it.
I'll just add on, and I will say that my specific focus is on the money. So there's a lot of other contacts that you're going to get that would probably layer on and make a fuller picture of this. But I will say, from following the money part of this, there's really no locus of government that owns the problem. And so we have, obviously, the federal government funds this kind of like little slice that comes in on the side. And local communities they have different priorities from one to the next, which is by definition inequitable. But if you've ever been in a legislature when a proposal was made to overhaul the state funding formula, first of all, it's very rare that happens. Maybe once every 30 years in a state do we change the funding formula. And part of the reason we don't change it is because everybody cares about it. It's almost like everybody, like if there's always going to be winners and losers. Every single neighborhood has a school in it, right? So every legislator represents educators. There are unions that represent tremendous numbers of people who work in schools. I mean, that's different than the military. I mean, education is very, very labor intensive. And so if you've ever been in a legislature when a proposal came that we're going to change the formula and we're going to do this instead, you can watch the entire legislature go, and they're looking for their district and whether their district gets more or less money from the change. So the political dynamic is just, it's extremely complicated. When you chase down a state ed chief and say it's inequitable in your state, they say, well, we have local control in our state. There's this sort of finger pointing constantly around this. So I think that's in a way what makes this institute so exciting, is we figure out what kind of responsibility that you're able to build out of all of this, and we're really all counting on you.
I've been reflecting on something that the tour guide said this morning at Monticello when I went, about what Jefferson thought about the problem of slavery, and that it was like the angel and the devil on opposite shoulders, understanding that it was unjust and understanding that justice was something that we should pursue in a progressive nation, but also thinking about the problem of self-preservation. And I think, as I think about the problem of education and equal rights in education, that the bane of our educational existence is around self-preservation and selfishness. And it's embedded in the law. I mean, in some ways, I don't know structurally, I'm not a legal scholar, but if the principles, the constitutional principles are not there that are collectivists around restorative or reparative, then how then do we actually operationalize or implement things? How do we change the ethos in the larger public sphere, in our communities, so that we're just not getting our own? I think that's really, this is the public good, private good problem. We know it can be done. Look to other countries. Canada, they do pretty well, relatively speaking, comparatively speaking, to the rest of the world, but they don't have the same orientation to helping their residents and citizens the same way that we do in the U.S.
So we'll have one last comment, and then I'll take questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think we don't close opportunity gaps because we don't want to co-sign what Prudence was saying. We have a system that works for some and not for others, and so for those who it works for, there's no incentive to change the status quo. But we have to change the narrative to show how, you know, things like credit card debt or student debt affects our overall economy and hurts everyone, as Heather McGee states really eloquently in her book, The Sum of Us. And so, unfortunately, research does not influence policy, but public sentiment does. And so, as researchers and advocates, what we can do is really push for public sentiment and ideology to change. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is to center student voice and have students be a part of conversations like this. As I'm sure some of our legal colleagues will talk about soon, that really can change hearts and minds.
Wonderful. All right, questions from the audience? Wait, there's a mic coming to you. We have to hear you for the live stream.
Oh, hi. I had a question for Professor Kundu, and I think it kind of touches on what Professor Carter was getting at, in that the law allows us to be fairly selfish with respect to these policies. But like Professor Kundu, when you were talking, you kind of mentioned this focus on there should be a way about almost enforcing democratic decisions, right? Like as it stands with like white flight and elitism and redlining, or the history of it, like democracy is not genuine. And so I guess, I don't know, that point kind of stuck out to me, and it was kind of hard to imagine ways in order that we would, you know, force that, you know, democratic ideal, if you had any ideas.
I think a lot of it comes down to funding and accountability. It might sound radical, but what if we had a different funding system where instead of your local taxes going to your local school, it went to the school a neighborhood over? Then all of a sudden we would be a little bit more invested in what's happening at other schools. That may sound a little too radical for America right now, but I feel like we have to try different things. Ultimately, I think it also comes down to how we define democracy, achievement, and well-being. And, you know, I was hopeful that the pandemic would illustrate a little bit of how interconnected we are, and that one person's plight affects all of us, and it can be an overburdening on our institutions, from hospitals to schools to law enforcement. So the interconnection is something that I don't know, I think we have to keep talking about cross-disciplinary, cross-age groups, across forums, because I think closing opportunity gaps is really a fight for democracy, but we have to help people understand that.
Hi, I have a question for the group as a whole. I have been hearing these themes throughout today that that this is not a zero sum, and that we can all benefit, when we close the gap on these inequalities. But I've also heard statements about how these inequalities persist because it's in the self-preservation or certain interests of people to keep them. And I'm reminded of, I just finished Matthew Desmond's most recent book on poverty, where he makes that argument that that poverty persists because it's enabled by the wealthy people, because it's in their self-interest to do so, and that it's really intentional to have poverty, and that that's his explanation for why it persists despite our wealthy nation. And as I'm sitting here trying to reconcile these ideas, I don't know if the idea is that there's kind of a short-term sacrifice by some for a long-term benefit for all, or if there's some other ways to reconcile these ideas, or are they competing ideas that on the one hand there is no cost, or that it's in all of our interest to have equality in education, and on the other hand, that there's a real self-interest by some not to have that equality. So I'd love to hear from all of you on that.
I want to be hopeful, and I feel like we're getting a little, like, it's heavy, but it's real, and so we need to be pragmatic. I don't necessarily know, and maybe data will show, that most people are sitting around saying, let me keep the foot on those who's less than. I don't think people are intentionally or consciously doing that. I think that we live in a country that signals culturally something about success and thriving and flourishing that make us competitive. And we do need the arts and media and such to help change the narrative. That's why, this is a multidimensional problem that requires so many different players in it to help us. This is why, to go back to what your fundamental purpose is, matters to me. The government's supposed to be for, of, and by the people. And that's why I think the federal government's role needs to be expanded. I really think the federal government's role can help to reduce and maybe ameliorate this. Now, where do you get the political will is another thing. That's why we need all the different kinds of ways, from religion to media and all of those things, to help shift people's mindsets. And I think higher education is implicated in this. We don't talk enough about how selective colleges and universities have also fueled this anxiety. Because I don't think that we would have this kind of test score anxiety, we'd have this kind of competitiveness about who's getting what and who's getting too much, if it weren't for about 200,000 college spots held by maybe 50 schools and colleges and universities, and everyone thinking that the return on the investment of that is so great that my child has to get in. That's the affluent class, not everyone. I really think that that's a fundamental part of the problem, which is why we need an intervention that is above people, that is of people, for people, but with leaders who have a transformative, equity-minded orientation. And we have to put them in power. But so, and I just hope, that's what I want from our government. That's why, and I don't know if you leave it just to the local or state where there's more self-interest that is allowed to grow and blossom, that it will be effective, which is why the federal role needs to be expanded. That's what I would say.
Like Prudence, I would encourage us to be optimistic. It's important to remember, in the long arc of American history, we are vastly more fair and just and equal than we were 200 years ago, right? The inequality under slavery, the women couldn't vote and didn't have rights as persons. It's important to remember that we are capable of a society and have changed dramatically in the direction of being a more just and equal society. We are far from where we would like to be in an ideal sense, but we have lots of examples from history of ways that we've changed. And in many cases, the law or the federal government has been the spear that has driven that, but it doesn't do it without a certain kind of public will behind it. And I do think it's not just that people work in their economic interest. If everyone just worked solely in their economic interest, the 99% would overthrow the 1%. We would tax them until they looked like the rest of us, right? But we don't, right? And so there's a kind of set of moral idea or norms in America about, well, it's, you know, freedom and competition, and I might be that guy, and it's usually a guy, right, in the top 1% or something. So I don't want to tax it. So it's not just that people work in their own economic interest. It's that we have a set of kind of norms and values that many people share, even those for whom it's maybe not in their immediate economic interest. And so I think thinking about how we kind of provide frameworks to help people sort of think about change and envision something different is important. And I don't know what those are exactly, but I know we've done it lots and lots of times in our history. And you know, it's a rocky road, it's up and down, it's not steady progress, but if you keep the long arc in mind, we've come a long way, we have a long way to go. You guys are going to help us keep going, right?
Absolutely.
Don't get down.
Yeah, and we'll jump in here, which is that, you know, one of the things that we're going to highlight at the Education Rights Institute is the interest convergence of our society investing in education that we all benefit. So, for example, education is closely related to our criminal justice system. The more you educate people, the more you reduce crime. Most people are not for more crime, but they don't always know that connection. The more you educate students, the more that people vote and are engaged in our democracy. The more you educate students, you improve health outcomes that reduce our, you know, social welfare costs. The more you, I mean, it just goes, the list goes on. And so I think I know that one of the things that the Education Rights Institute will focus on is that we have to understand that our investments in education, it's pre-K all the way through, those reap dividends for us all. And I think that's a narrative that isn't talked about very much. It is presented as a zero-sum game, and part of what we want to do is shift that narrative to we invest in education because it sort of raises all ships, sort of building on that Derek Bell idea of interest convergence to focus on education. So with that, we are going to take a 10-minute break as we set up for our next panel.